of Architectural Science as part of our 2019-20 lecture series. And this evening, I'm very pleased to welcome critic and curator of contemporary architecture and urbanism and Vancouver-based consulting urban designer, Trevor Boddy. Trevor's most recent books are City Builder, The Architecture of James K.M. Cheng, Glacier Skywalk.
Do the Vanna White.
James K.M. Cheng, City Builder, Glacier Skywalk.
I don't get royalties, so I have no moral.
And Stantec Airports. His book, The Architecture of Douglas Cardinal, was awarded the Alberta Book of the Year, and his writing on buildings and cities have garnered Canadian and international awards, including the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada Advocacy Award, the Jack Webster Journalism Award, and UIA-CICA's Pierre Vago Prize for Best Architectural Criticism Worldwide, with texts published in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Japanese. As a curator, Trevor created the 2014 Rethink Behind San Diego's Skyline and the Vancouverism Architecture Builds the City exhibition for the 2008 London Festival of Architecture, remounted in 2009 in Paris, then in Vancouver for the 2010 Olympics. He was also instigator and co-curator of the 2014 Critical Junctures Symposium at London's Victoria and Albert Museum. He has held academic positions at UBC, University of Oregon, Manitoba, Carleton, and Toronto, and lectures globally on contemporary design. So that's the official introduction. On a more personal note,
Good stuff.
I've known Trevor for a very long time. I was just thinking today, Trevor, it's 35 years. I met Trevor when I was a student at UBC, and he was one of my profs, I guess very early in your academic career. And Trevor was maybe the first person I met who knew a lot about, cared a lot about, and wrote a lot about Canadian architecture. A relatively rare breed, and I have to say that there have been certainly a lot of influences coming from Trevor in a current generation of architecture scholars and critics who are focusing on Canadian architecture. You were one of the pioneers, Trevor. So I'm very pleased to welcome Trevor here this evening. I should also add, Trevor, of course, is a Western Canadian, and the reason I mention that is I associate a certain kind of character that Trevor embodies really well. It's a very healthy disrespect for authority. So I think we are in not only for a very informative, but a very entertaining lecture. So welcome, Trevor.
Thanks. Well, Marco didn't tell you the good stuff is that after my students, when I started at UBC, were about my age and usually smarter than me, like Marco. So we kind of grew up together, and a lot of them are friends for life. And the irony is that Marco took my course in Canadian architecture, a little course, and then he ended up becoming editor of Canadian architecture, and I wrote for him. So this is the kind of strange inversions you get in a small little community. Okay, if the internet had been working at the Pantages Palace Hotel, I would have opened with an image of Bette Davis here. There's a great movie, get it sometime, called All About Eve. All About Eve is where Bette Davis plays the aging star, and she can't go on, and she's replaced by the understudy who blows her away. You know, just it's all about the intergenerational rivals. My first announcement to everyone here tonight is that I'm not Danish. I'm not a green, tall, thin, ex-OMA, Koolhaas protege, here to talk to you about Danish architecture. Yeah, he couldn't come. So you get the Canadian sloppy seconds instead of the tall, thin Dane. So anybody who has to leave now, there's almost no Danish content other than this, because I am quite close to Bjarke Ingels, as you know, whose Vancouver house is just going to open. In fact, people are moving in this week. Only in Canada. This is the developer, Ian Gillespie, who's doing Mirvish Village here and doing a project on King Street, et cetera. Out of the blue, Ian Gillespie phones me. The first word he says on the phone was, Gesamtkunstwerk. And I go, huh? Ian, what do you mean? And then he said, Gesamtkunstwerk. Then I said, Gesundheit. They said, Ian, I know what Gesamtkunstwerk means. I teach architectural history, total design. What are you saying? He says, I want you to do an exhibition called Gesamtkunstwerk on this building that we're doing with Bjarke Ingels in 5 years. It's just a design now. And we're going to do an exhibition about a building it's just been designed. So $1 million later, this is the opening of the exhibition. Ian Gillespie, the developer. You could buy a house, even in Vancouver, with that model. It's maybe not a house, a condo. $490,000 model, et cetera. And I did this exhibition on it. So I just wanted to get the Danish content out in the open, exposed. From this point on, I'm not Anders Lindiger talking about green architecture in Denmark. Okay, and there it is. Rendering of Vancouver House going up, and there's the said very expensive model. And shot construction last year. As I say, it's about to open. Now, just before I started in my actual lecture, Mega Micro, a couple commercials. These are kind of things I'm plugging or things that you should know about. In a couple days, on Friday of this week, this prize is being given out, the OurISE International Prize. It used to be called the Moriyama Prize. It was founded and funded by Raymond Maury, and it's very unique in architectural culture because it's a prize for a building, not for a career, not for end of your tombstone kind of demarcation. It is for a building. So there's a number of buildings submitted around the world. They have a very thorough process of whittling them down, and the last 3 are shortlisted, and we'll know on Friday at Harbour Castle in a big la-di-da. But it's a very, very nice bit of opening up Canada to global influences. And I'm just going to show you a quick image or two of the 3 finalists. There's Raymond, and there is his Riyadh Museum of Saudi History. I got to go there with Raymond and Ajon for the opening of the building, and we went out into the deserts west of Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and for dawn, I had to get up at 2 a.m. I got up at 3 a.m. in Vancouver to be here today, 2 a.m. We went out into the dunes and sat there and waited for the sun to come up. And this was the first time I had heard the full tale of Raymond Maury's experience in World War II, his internment and so on. And with his sons there, he spent about an hour or 2 as the sun came up talking about what it was like when at first his father was taken away. And Raymond had to run the hardware store in Powell Street in Vancouver and was selling refrigerators for $5 because he didn't know the price. And then ultimately he and his mother and brothers were sent off to camp as well. So I wrote a big long piece about it in the Globe, which was just nominally review of this building, but it was really about Raymond. And since then, he's very open about his World War II experience. So a plug for the prize, a plug for Canadian architecture, Canadian architects like Raymond looking out. Just quickly, these are the 3 finalists. This is Edificio E. It's a university building in a dry desert part of northern Peru. Kind of courtyards, kind of brutalist concrete buildings kind of meshed together. The whole ground plane is public space for students. Next one, this is a project in Senegal, northern part of Senegal, up near the Mali border, designed by a New York-based architect of Japanese background, Fumihiko Mori. And it's basically, as you can see, it's a roof. Sorry, go back and look at it for a second. It's as green as you can get. It's woven local bamboo and other materials, and it's in an artist center. A series of shading, roofs, et cetera, to permit classes, performances, and so on. So it's called the Thread Center, Fumihiko Mori. And then finally, this is by a Canadian, Siamak Hariri Ponsarini, here in town. This is the Bahai Temple for South America, just outside Santiago. a project that took CMAC about 15 years, and the shapes and the geometry was so complex at first they couldn't be done. Luckily, parametric design caught up with his ideas, and finally, and the funding caught up with it, and it opened a few years ago. So the Bahai Temple, Santiago, Chile. So some pretty impressive buildings. So that's commercial one. This is a memorial. It's a different kind of commercial. This is Charles Jencks, who was one of my teachers. I studied at the Architectural Association. I couldn't stand Calgary, needed to get out of Alberta, and I went to London. And Charles Jencks was my teacher. Rem Koolhaas is my teacher. Zaha Hadid was a fellow student. Stephen Hall. So basically, I kind of converted to becoming a critic, et cetera, based on this amazing experience in the late 70s. Charles Jenks's course was he was a brilliant lecturer. And of course, I liked him because he, like me, had a first degree in English. And then he studied architecture at Harvard. And this is what he looked like when he was my teacher. He always wore these velvet suits and bow ties, et cetera. Witty, very learned, et cetera. Charlie died about a week ago. And it's very interesting. His career is associated with postmodernism, which there's some people even in this room that everyone's looking at it again and talking about it, because it was the period that dare not speak its name for a while. But I think people are looking back about what happened in the 70s, 80s, even early 90s. This is probably his most famous book, A Language of Postmodern Architecture, and that's another teacher of mine, Charles Moore's Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans. So I've got a very strange formation. You've got on one side Charles Jencks and Charles Moore, who from the postmodern campus, two of my key teachers. On the other side, you have Rem Koolhaas and Rainer Banham. And Rainer Banham is a critic, and historian, but a high modernist, if you want. So I guess I'm a confused guy. I interpolate between those people, and I've learned a lot from all of them. There's Charlie late in life, a public sculpture he did in the garden for Watson, of Watson and Crick, the people who understood DNA. So it's a DNA-inspired public artwork by Charlie. And this is just a frontispiece for an essay I wrote for an academic journal. I do that occasionally. I did 15 years, probably 15 years full-time academic, and I dip my toes into it occasionally, like tonight. But I'm a practicing critic. I review buildings, I make exhibitions, and so on. You can get this online very easily. And this is basically my shtick. Everyone likes the idea of architectural criticism, but far fewer like the actual practice of it. And I go through the public loves it. I think the public wants to read and know architectural criticism, but there's a big problem. That is that architects, editors, developers, advertisers, magazines, and newspapers don't. So in other words, the means by which you would get your message out are often the problem. So architectural criticism is a dying field. There's 110 left in the world. People who live by writing on architecture in Canada could all get together in a taxi, okay? But we couldn't afford the taxi, you know? I mean, so we are a dying field, but it's not necessarily a bad thing to be. It's a pretty interesting thing, and we're morphing into other forums. Criticism is moving online. Everyone's a critic. It's everywhere available. But the sense of the public, of people sharing knowledge and talking about key urban spaces and buildings and architects, that is getting very, very hard to pull off. So tonight's talk, Mega Micro, was an essay I wrote about 10 years ago. And it's kind of nice, actually. I'm enough of an historian to dip back into a talk from 10 years ago and then freshen it a bit with some new slides and talk about it today. So this was commissioned for a book from publishers in Madrid, you know, the people who do AV, Arquitectura Viva, which is one of the best design magazines. They got a big bag of money in the boom days from BBVA, the big bank, Spanish bank, and they did these huge, oversized was going to be 10 volumes, a history of the recent past, basically architecture since the year 2000, all around the world. And every volume was devoted to a different continent or whatever. America, which is the European use and Spanish use of it, they mean North and South, Los Americas. And there's a number of fellow critics who did each country. I got the essay on Canada. So this talk tonight basically came out of a commission. I had to stand back and talk to a global audience about make some sense out of Canadian architecture since 2000. What are the themes? What do we do? What do we do right or wrong? So, and basically, I've sent this text to Marco and some of your other faculty members. Anybody who wants it, just ask them. They'll send you the PDF. And I have a version of Spanish, if anyone prefers Spanish. But basically, my theme is, when I squinted my eyes and stood back from Canadian architecture 10 years ago, two things really hit me. Was that the most interesting work was at either end of the spectrum. Massive, mega downtown transforming, huge projects, poly program, poly construction, poly material, mega projects at one end of the spectrum. Then at the other, these tiny little pavilions in nature. And what really triggered this is that the Governor General's medals for 2009 and 2010 were basically all cottages and single-family houses. It was really quite an amazing wave. And meanwhile, I was interested in the big boys in city building. So I thought, this is really interesting. Are we in an architecture culture that only validates precious little pavilions in nature? And I love them, as you'll see here. But I'm trying to make an argument that we in Canada do things well at the two ends of the spectrum. Now, if we have a little bit of time at the end, I'll deal with what I call the muddled middle, okay? I think in the middle range of size and projects, et cetera, Canada is actually quite weak. We don't do that as well. We have this funny expertise at two ends of the spectrum. So if you read the essay, I go into reasons for this, economic, historical, et cetera. I'll dispense of that. So we're doing mega and micro. If you get a chance right at the end, I'll do a little bit of muddle and middle. But we'll start with mega, okay? Now, mega, of course, is mega structure, mega building. This is one of my teachers, Raymond Maury, wrote this quite amazing book in the late 60s, early 70s. Megastructure, really interesting title, Urban Futures of the Recent Past. So even when he wrote this, it was kind of all over. You know what I mean? He was kind of capturing almost the melancholy of there being this moment in architecture where we hope to make these soaring, complex, city-integrating buildings, but then it kind of died as quickly as it rose. So really an intriguing thing. Canada is absolutely the darling of this book. Canada's got more projects than any other country because we tended to build megastructures very well. One of my favorites still there, next time you're in Montreal, go take a look. Place Bonaventure in central Montreal. When you think about it, what a mega project this is. There's a train station. You can hop on the train there and go to Toronto. There's a subway station. There's a convention center. There's a shopping center. There's an office building and a hotel. All of them stacked together into one enormous multi-block complex. Designed by Arcot, by Ray Affleck and his team in Montreal. And you think this was this started before Expo, Marco? Yeah, started before and really opened right after it. So I think it's a heroic bit of city building for Montreal in this period. It's brutalist, it's that rough béton roux, the rough concrete, et cetera, but an amazing conception, the audacity. And with all the connections, underground city connections, it's a really important hub for that and for transportation. And this is the convention center. A lot of people don't even know it's there, but you go in there and it's quite wonderful. It's got these beautiful waffle slab floors and columns to die for. And then up top, the hotel. Go up to the hotel, have a drink sometime, because it's a series of courtyards with two or three-story rooms around them. So it's like an oasis in the middle of the city, this rooftop hotel, Place Bonaventure. I don't know who runs it now. Maybe it's Hilton or something, but go take a look. It's pretty amazing. Now, megastructure is often associated with the Japanese. And certainly, they talked about it, they wrote about it, they drew it. The Japanese movement called Metabolism is dealt with by Raymond Maury in his book. But this is probably one you know less well. This is a drawing I actually first showed at that exhibition on Bjarke Ingels, commissioned by Ian Gillespie. This is a drawing that Arthur Erickson and everybody thought it was gone missing, was no longer around. In Erickson's book, his first book from Tundra, there's a little detail of about this much as an overexposed little sample. And Arthur kept telling me, he's a crucial mentor and friend of mine, he kept saying, he says, Trevor, it's all there. Vancouverism is in that drawing. And this drawing, by the way, is 1956, okay? In other words, this metabolist, this heroic, this megastructure for Vancouver predates most of the Japanese work and even European, Dutch speculators in megastructure. So what I'm saying, partly because we don't know our own history, Canadians were thinking about megastructure right at the beginning. Just so you know what you're looking at, imagine standing on the Burrard Street Bridge, looking west. This is where the planetarium is, there. That's a new bridge that Erickson proposed to link Point Grey, UBC, to West Vancouver. This is the west end, okay? And Erickson's scheme was to have these two soaring 60-story residential towers. You know, everyone gets a deck. This is before Moshe Safdie and Habitat. Everyone gets a deck, all that sort of stuff. Right here, I looked at that. I pored over the drawing with Arthur when we found it. I said, Arthur, it's too bad those smudges there. He said, Trevor, those aren't smudges. I said, well, what is it? He says, it's the green roof. Now, in 1956, there was hardly a green roof in Denmark, okay? So Arthur's proposing planting trees and gardens on the roofs of a megastructure. On top of that, too, there's a continuous podium, a base, multi-block base, out of which spring these high-density residential towers. So the things that you see a lot more of later in this talk, tower and podium, the kind of Vancouver urban language that Toronto never quite gets right, that is there in this drawing as well. So green roofs, tower and podium, organic form, soaring megastructure, 1956. By the way, it was done for a community organization, Community Arts Council. They asked Erickson and Massey to give some vision, future of Vancouver, and they wrote quite an earnest report about traffic control and all this stuff. And Arthur, off the side of his desk, did the sketch, but he knew it was too radical for the blue rinse set that ran the Arts Council, so he never included it then. And it kind of became this kind of document that we found and showed. And here it is on the wall of my exhibition with the text. And this is, we'll see a bit more of the exhibition in a minute. This is the Woodwards installation of my Vancouverism exhibition. Now, Arthur then gets a chance. First, you can argue that much of Simon Fraser is inspired by the megastructure movement. It is a megastructure in a way, because it is an entire university, which is more or less one continuous building that pops up and is expressed in different ways. But there's a continuity, a form there. Mountaintop University as one enormous construction. Even more evidently, though, in Robson Square, probably still Arthur's most famous work. I think you know the law courts there, the glass building. Way ahead of its time, that's a passive solar public building designed and built in the mid-1970s. There's no heat in there. It's heated by the gain on the glass, et cetera. So way ahead of its time, the space frame There was no commercially available space frames available then, so they engineered and made and fabricated the elements there. You have the waterfalls, the gardens, the stramps, the 3-block complex of Robson Square. Arguably, that's a megastructure as well. So, in other words, by 50s as paper architecture, 70s as actual built constructions. Here's detail of the law courts with this fabulous concrete frame out of which springs the space frame, et cetera. The young James Cheng was a detailer on a lot of this. A lot of the disposition of that massing is James Cheng as a recent architectural graduate. And then I think one of the key ideas in Canadian mega architecture is hybridity. Hybridity of program, hybridity of construction. You saw how concrete came together with glass and steel in the space frame there. And here you have what was basically a conference center with a theater downstairs, classrooms which are now used by UBC. Cornelia deserves every bit of credit she gets, Cornelia Oberlander. But Arthur himself is a brilliant landscape architect. So the basic conceptions of these buildings would be done by Arthur, and Cornelia implemented them brilliantly. So here is the garden, as you see, planted on top of the building, instead of gardens on the roof of Robson Square, waterfalls, etc. Cornelia, the world's most important landscape architecture prize has just been named after Cornelia Oberlander. So it's like having the Pritzker in Canada. Okay, so Vancouver stuff. I'm going to go through this quickly because you guys have probably heard and seen a lot of Vancouver. Oh, quick question. How many people have been to Vancouver in the room? Just put your hand up. Okay, that's good, 2/3. So I won't belabor this. I'm just going to whip through the kind of evolution of the Terran Podium and the kind of idiom of Vancouver architecture. Everybody thinks it was invented by planners, that Larry Beasley had a vision one night and made it. Not true. Terran Podium, these are some of my students' drawings looking at theme and variation of it. Terran Podium was invented in a handful of projects by James Cheng, which I've edited out of this talk to compress it. But this is a more recent Terran Podium by James Cheng, right down by our stadia, very tough site. I don't think, Marco, you were in that urban design studio, but I did an urban design studio for this really tough location between freeway ramps, the viaducts, an escarpment, grade change, big, ugly, horrible site. And everybody agreed that you couldn't do any housing until at least 7 stories up off the ground. So the site had sat fallow for a long time until James Cheng, together with Concord Pacific, figured out the secret was to, in some ways quite simple, expand the city's datum, the roadways, et cetera, of the city. There is an escarpment here. So what you see here is a city in the air, 7 stories above the ground, but continuing the street patterns, et cetera, of the city around it. The 4 towers, the townhouses at base. A little bit of color, rare for Vancouver, needed. But here's the breakthrough. Costco had never done an urban store before. Costco is based in Kirkland, Washington, which is 2 hours away. All of their executives had ski chalets in Whistler, knew Vancouver well, and pressure from Concord, from City Hall, from planners said, why don't you try a downtown store? Because we got this amazing space, and you're perfect for it, because Costco, you don't need windows, and good for a brutal spot, et cetera. So here we have a full-size Costco store with parking on 2 different parking grids. Costco demands an SUV, big car, friendly, wide spots. And then above it is the parking for the high-rise residents on a different grid. So you imagine those engineering heroics, having to reconcile 2 different structural grids for parking as you go up. Costco wouldn't budge on loading docks, et cetera. So it have to be, sort of semis can back in and offload the same way they do in every suburb in North America. So it was a very, very clever bit of knitting to get parking, Costco store, et cetera, as the foundation upon which an extension of the city is built with low-key townhouses and above that, high-rises. So this is the hybridity, hybrid programs, hybrid functions that I think we do well in Canada. And I think hybridity, if you're into the stock market of ideas, buy stock in hybridity. It's been an idea we're going to be talking about in architecture for decades. And there you get it. So the townhouses, the towers, and James has got a dab hand. Those are quite handsome townhouses. That's the stadium behind it with the billowing inflated roof, the old one. And Jim was into modular, the Corbusier's color theory at this point, so we applied some of that to these. You see the party walls extended up as a kind of gesture, as an open hand color. More James Cheng now. This is downtown, right by the convention center. A hybrid function, again, it's a hotel, Fairmont Hotel. On the lower floors, the shiny windows there, and on top of it, of course, a condo. There's a great tales. I think there's something called Boddy's first law. The reason why anything happens in Vancouver is real estate. Boddy's second law is the reason why anything has ever happened since the founding of the city in the history of Vancouver is real estate. In other words, everything can be understood from our street grid, for example. We have Granville Street, which goes north-south like San Francisco and every other West Coast city, and then it bends 45 degrees through downtown. And I read all these hooey theories of it. What it had to do was that the Canadian Pacific Railway studied other railway boomtowns, Tacoma, Oakland, et cetera. And speculative investment, just like now, was the name of the game. People would buy lots off of plans never having been out there. When you have a north, south, east, west grid for downtown areas with big buildings, bigger buildings, 3-, 4-story buildings, all the south-facing lots would sell out. And the north-facing ones were dogs. They couldn't move them. So you bend the grid to equalize the solar factor. This is 1870s. Electric lighting is just coming in. Orientation south really made a difference. So the downtown Vancouver grid is cranked 45 degrees to make it more sellable to spec investors. So that's a whole other talk. I do a talk on Vancouver where you basically analyze the city in 4 different land deals. 4 contracts where public goods spaces were given away to private interests to build the city. Fairmont Pacific Rim, so hotel, the function rooms at the base. I had some fun, when all of the cabins up north by Patty Hansen and Bridget Shim and Howard Sutcliffe all got the GGs that year. Everything was a cottage. I argued that if we chainsawed the suite and put it on a northern lake, it would get a Governor General's. Jim got a Governor General early in his career, never applied for one again. But it's just as handsomely detailed as any of those pavilions on lakes up in Muskoka. And ballrooms, et cetera, down low. This is not by Jim Jencks, by a guy called Nigel Baldwin, but a very interesting example of the hybrid Vancouver model. This is a Home Depot stacked on top of a Save-On or a Loblaws. Stacked, and on top of that, a Winners, and on top of that is a village on the roof for 500 people. In other words, the roofs of big box stores have now become urban spaces in Vancouver, very valuable. You think how big they are, So this is called RISE, R-I-S-E, and I think a very handsome little project. That's a roof garden there with great views to the mountains and so on, 2 or 3-story, very intimate scale. On the roof, literally above a Winners, which is above a Home Depot, which is above a Save-On Foods. Hybrid functions. This is an exhibition at the Vancouver Art Gallery called We Vancouver, 12 Manifestos for the City. And the Vancouver Art Gallery commissioned me to to be in the show and to write a kind of, they knew that I'd been a student of Rem Koolhaas, and Rem, of course, wrote his retroactive manifesto for Manhattan, Delirious, New York, and they asked me to do something like that. So I wrote something called Hybrid City, and I've given an original of this to Marco if any of you want to look at it, or you can find it on my website. You can get the text. So it was a 800-word manifesto for the city, and I argued that this notion of hybridity that I've been making the last few slides adds up to something called hybrid city, which is something we make in Canada, these hybrid functions, hybrid constructions. I argue in Vancouver we have hybrid diets. We have a diet that's half Asian, half North American, et cetera. Hybridity is what we do. And then they took the manifestos and they put them on construction sites all over the city and documented it. And Surrey is an extremely interesting kind of postmodern suburb. It's a little bit of, oh my God, Markham, and you could, 2 or 3 different suburbs from here, you could argue they're similar. Immigrants don't go to Vancouver anymore. They bypass the city and go to Surrey, and mainly Surrey, but a few others. Bing Tom, one of my mentors, has been much involved with urbanizing the downtown. Surrey had no downtown, not at all. And then the rail line, SkyTrain came out there, and there was an opportunity. The provincially owned insurance company, car insurance company, was going to put its headquarters out there for political reasons. And then Bing talked them into getting a little more ambitious. There was a shopping mall on site, and basically Bing found a way that the shopping mall could never close, kept operating. And on top of the shopping mall, they built the tower for the insurance company and a university, a branch of Simon Fraser University for 5,000 students. It's now got the highest academic standards of any university in BC. You have to have a higher grade point to get into Surrey, SFU, than to SFU or UBC. And these are hardworking immigrant kids who do very well. And this is a pretty amazing evidence of the power of this project, Surrey Central City. 4 years after the building was completed, it became the logo of the city. In other words, there's such investment in that building and recognition of its power that it becomes the symbol of the city right out the gate. Many of you have seen this. This is Bing Tom working with the brilliant mass timber engineers, Fast and Epp. And these are turned Paralam columns. Paralam is a composite wood project thing. They have this huge lathe. They turn them on these huge lathes, and they could taper the beams down. These fittings, the feet and caps for these columns, I thought to be absolutely gorgeous objects. So in my Vancouver exhibition in Paris and London and Vancouver, I showed full-scale pieces of this, elements. Talking about the engineer's aesthetic, I don't know many architects who could detail something that gorgeous. By the way, it was inspired by Ski Boot. Epp has 9 children. Fast has 7. And they had spent a long time on ski slopes, looked at ski boots a lot. They're good Mennonite boys with huge families. So the notion of a ski boot as the anchor, where the Paralam beam turned on a lathe above, connecting into the steel point. Just as interesting, this is still Bing Tom architect, Fast and Epp wood engineers. This is the atrium of the University of Simon Fraser there. These are what is known as peeler cores. In the plywood industry, you take a log and you spin it, and a huge knife cuts off sheets of veneer, and those are laid up to make plywood. When you get to the center of the log, the lignins are not as good, can't really be used for that. So they were being thrown away, or used as firewood, or used as fence posts. And you get them for almost nothing. So the engineers in Bing had the idea, why don't we use these simple things, which are fine in compression, and we'll use them as the elements in a space frame. So you see, where Ericsson, the other space frames you've seen are in steel, these are in wood. And with the king post here in the center of the span to disperse the forces. And another part of the same SFU university at Surrey's central city. Here you're seeing more, if you want, more conventional parallel beams, et cetera. Those are faculty offices. But the amazing thing, back to my hybrid theme, where you see the people down there in the light at the bottom, that's the shopping mall that never stopped operating. In other words, faculty offices are literally in the same room as the shopping mall. Now, everybody thought that would never work and there'd be a huge pushback, but it actually works very nicely. You have a real town and gown relationship like you don't get in Canada very often. So the mall continued to operate it. On top of it is the university. On top of that is an office tower. And again, just an exquisite piece of design. This is just the connector piece designed by Fastinet with Bing Tom for the cables for this portion of the building. And in our London and Paris shows, Bing did the speculative model about what he thought the next phase could be. Never went ahead in that form. But Bing did get to do this building just a block away. This is the main branch of the Surrey Public Library. And you see definitely an influence of Zaha Hadid here, but I think it's a handsome building in its own right. This is the library on the left, looking back at the office tower of Surrey Central City. Some very ingenious use of natural light. There's very little artificial illumination in here other than at night. Those surfaces are reflectors of light as much as anything else. They did a lot of very serious daylighting studies, et cetera, to make a library that really worked that way. And it's a very, very exciting space. When I take my global architectural visitors there, they can't get over the variety of people there. They see Sudanese, they see Guatemalans, they see Ukrainians, Moldovans, Indonesians, this polyglot, postmodern suburb that is Surrey, manifest in their children and young people come into the library to get ahead. It's a very, very exciting space. This is an Arthur Erickson project. Again, I think another encapsulation of the spirit of that Plan 56 imaginary drawing. He actually got to build a little piece of it right in the early 70s. It's called the Evergreen Building. It was for a lawyer. The lawyer couldn't decide if he wanted a residential building or an office building. He said, Mr. Erickson, could you design it so it could be converted to either? And Arthur said, gladly. So this side is facing the harbor. It's got the organic side with the decks, terraced decks. Cornelia Oberlander did the planting and so on. And the other side, on the right side, is Pender Street, downtown street. So it's got an urban edge, and it has a soft harbor edge. And you know, when you're teaching design studio, you're always talking to students about how to turn the corner when you've got different conditions, et cetera. And this is the paradigmatic example anywhere, where Erickson has one single sonotube column, pulls back the massing, bevels it off there, et cetera. So this architecture is completely different from the architecture on the other side. How do you reconcile those two? When you're in Vancouver, go take a look. It really is a tour de force in doing that. I do this as preface to show you what's happening now next door. This is a project that's under construction, designed by Shiguro from Tokyo. Turns out Shiguro has been an enormous fan of Erickson for 30 years. Why? Well, I think many of you will know Shiguro paper pavilions for the earthquake victims. When he got the commission, got the idea to build with paper, everyone said, oh, you should look at the work of Erickson in Vancouver. 1976, for the Habitat United Nations meeting in Vancouver, Erickson and his staff designed an all-paper pavilion, temporary pavilion in front of the Vancouver Art Gallery, where cardboard sonotubes and other things are the structure. And for the membrane of the roof, et cetera, they got school kids all over the Lower Mainland to laminate layers of newspapers to make these curved shapes, which are then put on the roof. Shiguro looked at this and figured he adapted some ideas of this to become the Kobe temporary paper houses, which launched his career. He ends up getting the Pritzker Prize 10 years later. Every time he came to Vancouver, he always wanted to go look at Ericsson Building. He went to see the Evergreen Building. Boom, he loved it. So a small developer, Port Living, a guy called Toby Reyes from Manila, had bought it. It's 66 feet wide. It's a tiny little Tokyo-style infill project on one side of Evergreen. And only because of Evergreen did Sugar Band say yes to it. So what we're seeing here is, you'll see more of this in a moment, but the base of the building is a direct continuation of Ericsson's concrete detailing, et cetera. Then on top of it is a mass timber penthouse of 8 stories, a wooden birdhouse, if you want, on top of the base. Here, I'll show you. So there's Ericsson's Evergreen at the bottom, and then you see what Sugarman has done. His new construction, 66 feet wide at its most, a slot site, another building here, picks up the detailing of Ericsson and makes a base, goes all the way up, and then it's mass timber from that point up. So hybrid construction, hybrid, a kind of Tokyo-type infill of a tiny little space that everyone else would look the other way about. They've hired Cornelia. Cornelia's doing the gardens there, et cetera. And it's up to about the 3rd or 4th floor construction now. So here you get Ericsson, lower floors, the Evergreen Building. From here over is Shigeruban, all the way up with the birdhouse on top. The developer says he just hit the right point of the boom for this. If they proposed it a year later, it never would have gone ahead. Prices and revenues are so high, they could afford to do this. And even the detailing, this is up, the penthouse is up top. If you look at the mass timber, the softened ceilings, et cetera, all of that is also inspired by Ericsson's wooden architecture. So you have a Tokyo architect, Pritzker Prize winner, doing a homage to one of our architects right in Cole Harbour in Vancouver. And a few blocks away, this is Kengo Kuma. Kengo Kuma is doing a project for Ian Gillespie of Mirvish and of the King Street project with Bjarka. And this one is, again, just starting construction. Very, very interesting detailing on this. Metallic panels, an enormous garden at the base, a high-end Japanese restaurant. Again, I'm just having to fly by this, but this is, we're just ending mega now with one of our most famous mega projects, which is the Woodwards project, which is a program that only Vancouver could devise. This tower is condos, market, for sale, $500,000 to $2 million. Next door, this is a combination of condos, social housing, and offices. Over here is the art school for Simon Fraser, Fine Arts Academy. Simon Fraser, on top of it, that's housing for the hard to house. It's for people who are both addicted and have mental problems. So they're literally looking 100 feet away from the condo owners. You put them all together in this utopian brief. I think the program of this complex called Woodwards is the most interesting thing about it. The architecture by Gregory Enriquez is not the greatest, but I think the pure chutzpah of saving a portion of the Edwardian department store, fine arts school, social housing, market housing, family market housing is pretty amazing, all in the same block. And when it just opened, my Vancouver's exhibition, we got to install it there. I had to adapt the design from what we'd shown in Paris and London. We had no walls to hang stuff on, so we had to make a long table for models and with panels of photos. By the way, this all comes from a Wizard of Ed comic. There's a great Wizard of Ed comic where there's a freak show today, circus tent. From one side comes the fool, the other side comes the king. They come in the next frame, you see them, and they're at a rope looking at each other. The freak show is just to see each other, you know what I mean? So that was the idea here, interspersing the panels with the didactic material and then there's people on the other side. You're looking at people. So in other words, it's bringing people into the experience of the exhibition. And this is just some of the London installation. This is the structure. I can't take claim for this. A student working for Bing Tom came up with the idea. We could get tons of wood, of cedar, from the cedar industry. How do we use it? Someone had this great idea of taking blocks of cedar, shaping one end of each block male, the other end female, drilling holes through it, threading steel cable through it, then tightening it to make a rigid serpentine. In other words, taking little bits like pearls on a string and collectively making a kind of wall element out of them. So here we're doing studies of Canada House in London, right on Trafalgar Square, opposite the National Gallery. But we could not touch any element of the building, nothing. The fence, the building, et cetera. So the serpentine was very attractive because it's a self-supporting shape. That's why 18th century gardens have serpentine walls, because they don't fall over like straight walls do. They have a stability. And here's a study getting close to the definitive one. They required, Westminster required building permits. We had to do fire testing. We had to load it to failure. This is in a lab in Delta, BC, testing it. I got 1.5 million Aeroplan points from Aeroplan. So I would fly crews from Vancouver to London to erect this. We had engineering and architecture students working on it. As you see, all the sinuous cedar doesn't touch the building. And this is erecting. Bing and I, one night, just located a bunch of spotlights, uplights, and lit it. There it is in its glory. Okay, well, you get mega. You'll know this stuff better, so we'll go quickly through it. These are some of the winners, the cottages and tiny pavilions that won the GGs that year. This is a Patty Hansen cottage up in the north, which is this. So this is a project by Penner, an architect in Winnipeg. This is a tiny little Patcow house, a one-bedroom house with a one-car garage, but the owner is quite wealthy, has houses in Singapore, London, Paris, etc. That one-car garage has 3 Maseratis on a hydraulic lift. So he stores his cars here, and it's a really strange life because he almost doesn't live there. There's like 4 shirts in the closet, and he comes in, and right by the phone, there's 30 different takeout food menus. He gets off the airplane, orders food in, gets in one of the Maseratis, and then drives a Whistler in 18 minutes or something. Like, because he can let those cars rip in Vancouver in a way he can't in Hong Kong or Singapore or Paris. It's called the Shaw House. Shaw is the name of the owner. And that's Patcow's from about 15 years ago. And like I say, it's a one-bedroom house with this lap pool, glass bottom, with a wonderful play of light inside. This is a house in Salt Spring Island, again by John and Patricia Patcow. I think you get this kind of high end of Canadian architecture, tiny little pavilions in nature, something we do well. This is an under-publicized project by Peter Cardew, who's now probably in his last weeks. So I wanted to show something of him. You see the wooden houses there, same slot a normal wooden house would go. You found a way to put 4 units around a courtyard, a Parisian-style courtyard. It's called Odlum Court. Very, very intriguing conception of how to densify in a very handsome, painless way. It was so good that the city banned it, didn't permit any more of these anywhere. Here's the courtyard, hard surfaces, one good tree in the courtyard, hard surfaces, parking underneath. This is another summer pavilion by Penner in Northern Ontario, not far from Winnipeg. I think you all know Bridget Shim and Howard Sutcliffe's work, so don't have to go through this as much, but you know the kind of micro finesse details, exquisite objects in nature, going right back to the Barbara Frum house, and I think you all know the Integral House in the Don Valley here. A bigger house, but again, the same aesthetic. And a project you may not know as well, Barry Sampson, I think, is retiring soon. So him with George Baird and John Newart, their younger associate, was mainly responsible for this. This is a museum, a kind of interpretive center at French River up near Georgian Bay. And again, it's basically a one-room museum with these kind of site works inspired by the breakup of ice, et cetera. I think it's an exquisite little pavilion in nature, like the things we do well in Canada. I think most of you will also know Brian McKay Lyons on the East Coast, you know, the box perched at the edge of the continent above the landscape, often very simple detailing and framing. Brian kind of does the same house over and over again, but it's a pretty good house. You may not know this one. I'm nearly done. We're in the last couple projects here. This is my long-term collaborator and friend, Jeremy Sturgis from Calgary. Brewster, the people who run the bus company up in Banff, had the opportunity to do a tourist attraction here. What they're finding is that everybody drove from Banff to Jasper and didn't even stop. And the people who most unlikely to stop were new immigrants. They'd come from suburbs of Calgary or Edmonton and just drive through. And they figured they needed to have attractions that did not require hiking and camping, et cetera, for people so they could appreciate the nature. So the idea is that this spot has got about a 1,500-foot drop. It's an overlook. And the idea was to build a bridge that would cantilever you over the valley with a glass bottom floor, and then a series of exhibits in a promenade architectural, you know, the Corbusier idea of a architectural promenade. So you're dropped off at the top of the drawing. You go through some exhibits, didactic exhibits about nature and geology and flora and fauna, and you end up at the bridge and take a look. And these are some of the competition drawings done by Jeremy and his team. They came up, Jeremy found rocks stained with iron oxide on the site. They thought immediately of Corten steel because it's long-term, no maintenance kind of material. Here's the actual built thing. So you see the Corten with wood where it needs to be wood. And some of these pavilions, didactic pavilions as one progresses, you take a path one way and then back the other. And then it comes up to the bridge. You go through this archway and there's material on the wall. And then out to the main bridge. And looking back from the bridge to the bus drop-off. There's a little, it's a very interesting idea. This is a little mini bridge to prepare you for the big thing. Because it's pretty scary to go out there and look 1,500 feet down with a glass floor. So they built this little bridge, and it's like foreplay. It's like the advance. You go out there, and you look at the big bridge, and you go, oh, I could do that, whatever. So it's really an interesting choreography of forms and buildings and materials leading up to the big event. Now, that's not Photoshop. That's what it's like, the glass floors, et cetera. So that's Glacier Skywalk, and we put together a little book on it that you can take a look at later. Now, I think we're running pretty late, so I think I can tell you that most Canadian architecture is not as interesting as the mega stuff is, which reinvents cities and living, et cetera, at huge scale, and hybridity and all that. And not as exquisite as these little gems in nature, like the Shim Sutcliffe and Jeremy Sturgis' work I've been showing you. Most of our buildings are in the muddled middle, you know? And to find people who do well in the muddled middle, you got to give them a cheer. And I'm big supporters of the 546 gang in Winnipeg. Sasha and Johanna, I think they're amazing architects. They have zero budgets, tiny, tiny budgets. The most banal things like replace a walk-up apartment on an arterial road, which is this one. And what they do is they reinvent it. Rather than going normal typologies of the townhouse, you know, with grade entrance or the normal flat or apartment, they have this idea, almost inspired by Rubik's Cube, of having interconnected spaces throughout the mass. So you come upstairs and wiggle in and around. It seems more complex than it is, but it's a real variety of unit types, none of which are townhouses and none of which are flats. Extremely interesting, innovative bit. There it is by night. So who would have thought taking on the walk-up apartment and doing something original about it? So I think that's where the middle can be unmuddled. And they run their services through the plenums of the stairs from level to level. I hope they get a book going because this stuff really needs to be documented. So I think, I think I've given you a kind of pretty wild ride through a variety of our recent architecture. Something to look forward to on next Monday morning. This book is being launched, Canadian Martin Architecture book. Colin and Marco got a chapter in this. George Kapelis has a chapter. Hey, George, et cetera. So the Ryerson content is there, loud and proud. It's 544 very glossy, very thick pages. There are the names of 1,000 architects, 1,000 in here. And I'm probably the only person ever in the history of the world who's had to read it from cover to cover. So every word. Elsa Lam commissioned me to write a contextualizing essay for a Canadian architect about the history of architectural publication. And George, you'll be happy to hear that. I went right back to SSAC and where we first met in Saskatoon and London as young historian architect types. To contextualize, going from Alan Gowan's and the earliest books on Canadian architecture up to the present. And then I submitted the essay, and then Elsa and I looked at it and said, everybody's going to read this as a wimpy review that never gets around to reviewing the book. So she said, let her rip. So I wrote another 1,500 words, actually reviewing the book. It's in late editing. I don't know what'll stay in and what won't, but those in the room, come see me afterwards. I'll read you back what I wrote about your stuff, and it's overwhelmingly positive. But we're launching this. And my big surmise of this is the whole book is about that far away. And it's building after building, like in one sentence or two sentences. And you go to another one, another one, and another one. And you get the point to say, well, someone stand back and make sense of this. Say something. But the structure of the book didn't allow that. And the saddest thing of all is that Adele Weeder, my colleague from Vancouver, writes the last essay. And the last thing she writes about is Octon Astry's mass timber student residence at UBC, which is very strange because it's a mass timber building completely wrapped with fake wood, with digitally printed wallpaper, fake wood on the outside. And I call it POMO for the climate change era. Yeah. So anyway, the book ends like this, and there's no conclusion. So whether my chainsaw essay will be accepted as the missing final chapter of the book or not, we'll see. But they're no fools. Every architecture student in Canada will be assigned this book, I'm sure. And when you have 1,000 architects in there, each one of them has a mother, this will be the best-selling book in the history of Canadian architecture. Damn it, I wish I had a book like this and could get residuals like that. Anyway, thank you for putting up with this, and I'd be happy to take questions. Come on, one of you students jump in. Don't let the profs do it. They're so boring. George is probably going to ask me to read what I wrote about him, What's that?
We're waiting for real questions.
Yep.
So with the mega, what do you think are the key driving forces? Why did this happen early and so forcefully and so boldly and for many years?
It's such a boring answer, but it's such a Canadian answer. Banks. Canada has fewer and bigger banks than any other country of its size. In the United States, you have First Poughkeepsie National Bank, et cetera. There's 5,000 banks in the United States. Until recently, there was 5 in Canada. Now there's 15. So we had concentrated pools of capital. Our banks love real estate, okay? Because they're conservative investors long term. So we had money available to reinvest in our cities that was not available for American cities. And plus there's the issue of race tearing apart American cities. So in other words, Canada rebuilt or never allowed its downtowns to decline and reinvested it because of patient capital. The Canadian development industry, people like Ian Gillespie and my other clients, why are they the way they are? Well, because of banks. They are a creation of our banks. If you do a history of Canadian development, it's all about the linkages, Cadillac Fairview to TD, et cetera. So in other words, we have a kind of economic engine that does this. And then on top of it, you have attitudes to immigration, to race, to polyglot cities, which make a virtue out of hybridity.
So you don't think climate is that key?
I think it is too. I mean, obviously, you don't want to freeze your butt. You know, stay in one building. And Place Bonaventure, that was always the thing, a city in one building. You would take the elevator from floor to floor. Yeah, Scarborough, John Andrews, et cetera. The interesting thing is the megastructure era, George Baird writes a chapter in the book on megastructures. And it's very clear to him that it ended. It ended basically, he thought, in the 70s. I argue, and I disagree with George, I have to be careful because I'm staying with him and Elizabeth, but I disagree with him because I think in a lot of ways the work of Cheng and the mega developers, even Bjarke to some degree, is a continuation of the mega structure idea by other means. When you think of that hotel of James Cheng or the towers above the Costco, et cetera, I think those are the grandchildren of Place Bonaventure and Scarborough College. And certainly Jim says so. He's very frank about acknowledging that. Yeah. Does that help? Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah. I gave this talk first time a year ago. I offered it to Ryerson, and if I'm a good boy, you can have me back next year, and I'll give my resilience talk. I argue that the era of sustainability is over, or ending, and the whole idea of sustainability has some problems within it. And I think we're entering the era of resilience, another rebuild, rebounce, you know. We're not just passively trying to get back to a state of nature that has been lapsed, but we're trying to adapt to the new realities, et cetera. So again, I think in my stock market of ideas, speculations, buy hybridity and buy resilience. I think Ryerson will have a Department of Resilience Studies in 5 years. And we'll deal with everything from tsunamis and earthquakes and all that sort of stuff to adapting to change, you know, climate changing elements in buildings. I don't advocate massive climate change interventions or seeding clouds or anything, but I do think that we got to get off our duff and start to do things other than this notion that if we just use less and less ergs, we'll get there. So. Anyway, it's a paper I haven't fully written yet. It's a good one to test on the road next year. So I think it was very interesting to give it first in Yellowknife. And I'm working with the First Nations architect, Alfred Waugh, on his work. And Alfred is a great believer in the idea of resilience for First Nations communities. And basically getting past the grieving for the injuries, and they're huge, of the residential schools and the multi-generational suffering, but getting on with rebuilding communities and making them healthy and economically vital, et cetera. So that's where Alfie is. And he gets in a lot of trouble in First Nations circles by arguing resilience over a sustaining of anger, remorse, and pain. I think he's a really interesting guy. Alfred Waugh, someone you should have come speak here. He's the next Doug Cardinal. By the way, Doug Cardinal was the first architect I ever met. You want to know why I'm so weird? I was a 14-year-old kid in Edmonton, and I never met an architect, and I was obsessed. This is in the Canadian Architect piece, by the way, the full version. I go right back to the beginning. In Alberta, Safeway stores like Loblaws, they used to have a kids' encyclopedia called the How and Why book of whatever, chemistry or whatever. There's one on architecture. If you bought $10 worth of groceries for 69 cents, you got this little book. The one on architecture went from the caves and the pyramids. The last building in the book was Seagram Building, okay? Now, as an Edmonton 10-year-old, it did nothing for me. I'm in a gridded prairie city, boxes everywhere, big deal. The second to last project was Ronchamp by Corbusier, you know, with this funny hairdo roof and walls that are 20 feet thick here and 2 feet thick there and writing on the windows. It completely blew my mind. So I got the architecture bug at that age and perceived it ever since. And I'd never met an architect. I had 4 years telling my parents I want to be an architect. And my dad used to come home for lunches. Imagine this, an era when an executive would drive home and have a hot lunch with a family. And he used to do his mail, and he had Time magazine. And he said, oh, Trevor, there's this architect, and he's done a church in Red Deer. He's in Time magazine. And I took it and whatever. My mom got Yellow Pages. For the young people in the audience, it's a pulp and paper database. You know, used to, searchable by name. And she said, oh, his office is just 6 blocks from here. So I went after school in my parka. It was 29 below. Came into the room. The drafting room was half the size of this room. Far corner was a woman leaning over the drafting board, drafting. And no one else was there. The room was empty. I stood there for an uncomfortable amount of time. And I piped up and said, oh, hi, I'm a high school student thinking about architecture. Is Mr. Cardinal in? And the voice turned out not to be female, but male. That said, no, come back in an hour. So what do you do? It's 29 below. I walked around, until it was 5 o'clock, came back. And still, he said, half an hour. And finally, of course, it was Doug Cardinal he was in his hippie period with his ponytail down his back. Turn around, he had a bear claw necklace. Now, this is 1968. This is too cool for school. You can have long hair and wear bear claws. Okay, I want to be an architect. And then 2 hours with Doug, talking about life, architecture, everything. And we started a dialogue there. And 22 years later, we published the book. It took that long to do it. Meanwhile, I went to architecture school, became a prof and all that. So anyway, resilience is an interesting idea. Alfred Waugh and other people to watch for are exponents of resilience. And I can't really give it justice in a quick answer, but good for you picking up on that. I offered that to Ryerson. It didn't make the cut, but that could be on the menu for next year. Yeah. Okay, we had time for 1 or 2 more. Anybody else? Right back there? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think your generation's doing a pretty good job. The problem is that everyone's a critic, but we lack a common datum of experience. You know, the good old days of newspapers gave a kind of datum of information, and the city itself, there were spaces, et cetera, that you knew about. The new criticism is Instagram and Facebook and blogs and other things, right? But the trouble is it tends to be micro communities, talking to people your same age or same interests or same sense of humor. So the public mission of architecture criticism has kind of been lost. I think it's going to be regained. I think it has to go into new forms like novel writing or filmmaking and other things. Because there's, I used to have a column. I used to be the Alex B of Western Canada. I had a column in the Globe. Canada being Canada, Alex's and all the critics before, their columns would come to Vancouver, but none of the stuff I wrote ever came to Toronto. You know what I mean? One way doggy door, from the center of the universe. So I did that for years, but then they eliminated the gig, et cetera. There's no critic, and Alex is the last one left in Canada. Amazingly, Quebec doesn't have a critic on any newspaper. Most magazines don't have it anymore because, as you see in get that piece called The Conundrums of Architectural Criticism. I think I sent a PDF to Marco, or I will just talk to Marco. And that is a kind of summary of why we got to this place where it's kind of dying. I'm proposing a last waltz for architecture critics. We did a kind of version of it because one of our colleagues, in fact, our president of our organization, got the Reba Gold Medal. Joseph Rickwerk is an architect, and his early career was all criticism. Then he became a scholar and wrote amazing books. But he got the gold medal, the same medal that Rogers and Foster's, et cetera, got. Inconceivable. Would AIA ever give Michael Sorokin the gold medal? Not in a zillion years, you know? So this is such an amazing event that I organized the Critics of the World. 50 out of the 110 left showed up in London at the Victoria and Albert Museum and the AA, and we did 3 days of talks. And what we did is each of us spoke to one of Joseph's essays, one piece of writing. It was writers talking to writing. So anyway, everybody wants me to do it again, and we've been talking to Ken Frampton. Ken Frampton is now in his 80s. Everybody thinks it's a great idea, but Ken Frampton. So maybe we'll do it in spite of him, or we may do it for Phyllis or someone else. But it was a model that worked. So it was called Critical Juncture. And there's a book we published of the essays in it that you can probably get on interlibrary loan. Just look up Critical Junctures and my name. Yeah. Okay, last question, anybody? Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And like most architectural innovations, they hit Vancouver first and then they come to Toronto. Toronto is getting the Starchitect bug, Frank Gehry's towers, Bjarke on King Street, et cetera. But we've had it a little bit longer. Part of the reason is that our land prices got so absurdly high, you know, to justify it. It's kind of a marketing thing. You know, the romance and sexiness of a foreign name added. Like the one I showed you, the Port Living's Evergreen. I mean, you know, that goes for $2,000 a square foot. It's the only way you can pull off that architecture 66 feet wide, you know what I mean, and where it is. And even then, the boom is over, and they're having a hard time selling the last units. So I think it is an indictment of us as a nation. We are colonial. We look to American and British models. Now maybe we look to Tokyo more. We are still in a colonial situation in architectural culture because we don't have enough books, because we don't have enough journals, we don't have enough critics. We then defer to others. So I think it's a real issue. And back to the theme of my talk, key reason for that is the missing middle. Okay? In other words, we let the Shims and Sutcliffes and Patty Hansons do these beautiful little things, but they're not rolling out into bigger and bigger buildings, right? They're doing exquisite little park pavilions, et cetera. So in other words, they're not ramping up into bigger projects like Kengo Kuma did, like Shigeru Ban did, like Bjarke Ingels did. Because the middle is such a barren zone in Canada, we're not taking our talent and then pushing them through bigger and bigger things. You know, if you think of what John Andrews did in his 30s, or Douglas Cardinal, or Bing Tom, it's staggering. You know, they're given these huge commissions, and they're in over their head, but they did it. You know, we don't do that anymore. Architectural commissions are like insurance policies, and they want guaranteed result. One way to get a guaranteed result is to buy a brand name. So that's why we do it. As you see at King Street, Bjarke, they're marketing the hell out of that. I had done so well for them. I made West Bank a lot of money by finding that Erickson drawing and making it the centerpiece of my exhibition, because it legitimized Bjarke's ideas. And Bjarke referred to it all the time as a way to give a Vancouver element to it. So they did exactly the same template with Moshe Safdie and King Street. That's no accident. That was all engineered based on the Vancouver model. In other words, we get a famous architect, we quote him, we use it in our marketing, we convince people that this is the inheritor of habitat, and we've got it. So you see why I'm an unpopular guy? I speak the truth. I'll have to get out of town soon. Although West Bank are having a big party in the weekend, so I hope the wine isn't poison. But anyway, thank you all. Those are good questions, and we've just begun to talk. Thank you.